David believed in God's promise so much that the Bible tells us that whenever they captured soldiers in war, he took those people and he tasked them to be brickmakers. David spent the rest of his life, amongst other things, collecting building materials so that the temple could be built. That's an act of faith. God said, your son will build me a temple. David collected the materials. How likely are we to grab a hold of God's promise when you don't see the fruit right away? What if God told you he has a huge blessing in store, but you might not see it happen? But your job is to raise up the people who will see that happen. All right, thank you, Pastor Don. I'm excited to be here. It's not quite springtime, but it's better than it was, right? I'll take it. I only had to wear one coat today instead of two, so it was nice. Let me just start by saying again, thank you to Pastor Don and to Tyler and Phil for thinking of me and giving this opportunity to me to come up here and share with you guys today. I've been looking forward to this for a while. So here we go. Who knows? We'll start like a children's message. Who knows what's going on tomorrow? Anybody? Snow, yeah, not snow. No, we're not preaching about snow. It's the Super Bowl. Do you guys remember, as far back as I can remember, they've kind of gotten away from it for the last few years, but do you remember a time after the Super Bowl, they would interview one of the winning players and they would say, Joe Montana, you just won the Super Bowl. What are you going to do next? Hold on. There's a button to turn it on the side. I'm going to Disney World. Happier times. In case you don't know, that's Nick Foles. When the Eagles won the Super Bowl, he went to Disney World. After a long, grueling season, potential injuries all the time, people trying to hurt you, you had to overcome obstacles week after week after week. Then you make it to the playoffs, and you had to play more games and win those. Eventually, one team is crowned champion. They get to raise the Lombardi Trophy in a sign of victory. They get to take a break after that. They get to go to Disney World. Last year, about this time, January, February 2020, things were normal. My family and I had a plan to go to Disney World. Things happened in March. We were told just for 2 weeks, we're gonna shut everything down kind of. We're gonna stay quarantined for about 2 weeks to keep everybody safe. By the end of March, 2 weeks turned into 3 or 4 weeks, 2 months. Here we are today. As the season went on last year, we got into June, 4th of July, we didn't really do much. And at some point we had to decide that our big family trip to Disney was going to have to get postponed. We had to cancel the airfare, the rental car, the hotel, everything off the table. Needless to say, we were disappointed. However, we did find out that national parks were open. So we could fly into Boise for dollars. We bought 5 tickets. The family traveled to Boise, rented a car, drove across the country, and we ended up in Yellowstone. Along the way, we saw Twin Falls, Idaho. Beautiful spot. We stopped at Craters of the Moon. It's a little bit dark, but it's this really cool hundreds of square miles of a lava flow in the middle of Idaho. Really kind of neat. If you ever happen to be traveling through Idaho, it's worth a stop. My favorite picture, this is one that we took together as a family. We spent a week right in the Yellowstone area. We went to the Grand Tetons, which is what this is, my favorite stretch of highway that I've ever had the opportunity to drive down. We saw grizzly bears in West Yellowstone. We watched Old Faithful erupt together as a family. The girls took a day trip they took a horseback ride from a ranch up along this mountain stream in Montana. Frankie and I went fly fishing on the Snake River. Everything about the trip was a once-in-a-lifetime experience that we got to share together as a family before our kids got so old that they'll be taking their own vacations in a few years. But It's not what we had originally planned, but it turned out to be a tremendous blessing anyway. That's where I want to start the sermon today. Sometimes you expect one thing or you have a plan, and then it just doesn't work out. But in the end, God blesses it anyway. This series is about the covenant blessing. Tyler opened the series preaching about Abraham and God's plan to bless his family and that he would be greatly numbered. Abraham had to leave his home and go off to a new land that he didn't even know where the destination was when he left his house. Week 2, Pastor Don preached about God's covenant with Noah. God promised to never again flood the world as a consequence for sin. Last week, Phil talked about Moses. God promised to bless his people as they followed the law. Thank you. I'm talking right past my clicks. So, Abraham, right? God made a covenant with Abraham. He would bless his people. God made a covenant promise with Noah that he would never again flood the earth. God made a covenant promise with Moses that if he stayed faithful to the law, God would bless him and his people. We're going to talk about David today. Something you should keep in mind with these first 3 people, before we get to David, is that they had some things in common. First, they were all righteous. God did not choose to make his covenant promise with people who were questionable or wicked. They had a certain amount of faith and integrity before God entered into this covenant promise with them. That's important. Second, it took a measure of faith for each of these men to begin their journeys. Abraham had to leave, like we said. Noah built an ark before it started to rain. And Moses led people through the wilderness for 40 years. Each of them had a journey. Each of them had to take steps in faith in order to fulfill God's covenant promise. Something else to keep in mind, the fulfillment of the covenant promise that God made with Abraham, Noah, and Moses did not come to fruition in their lifetime. God made a promise and they had to stay faithful, even though it didn't exactly get complete within their lifetime. That brings us to David. There we go. To understand David's whole situation, why don't we talk a little bit about background? David was just a young man when he was anointed to be king. So all the way back about the time of David and Goliath, right around that time, Samuel had anointed him to be king. From there, his father Jesse had sent him out to work under Saul. Saul was the current king at the time. But things changed. As he was growing up, what he expected, there were challenges. There were obstacles that he had to overcome. Saul eventually became jealous and tried to murder David. Eventually, Saul's actions led to civil war. In addition to internal wars, there was also constant outside threats from Philistines, amongst other countries that were neighboring. They were always trying to attack the Israelites. One thing to note, Saul had allowed the Ark of the Covenant to be confiscated and taken away by the Philistines. If you read through Samuel, 1st and 2nd Samuel, you'll see that a lot of the personal relationships that David had in his life were traumatic. He had Jonathan, who was a good friend to him, but outside of that, most of the stories involving David and the relationships that were in his life or close by around him were filled with drama. Nonetheless, after Saul died, David became king of Judah. Israel at the time was not yet divided formally, but they were at civil war. So they were one country separated. Internal fighting. There is some commonalities between what we see today and what David had to go through as he was coming up as king as well. Nation divided. Leading up to what we're going to talk about today, after the death of Saul and David was king, he had a plan. First, in 2 Samuel 2, David became king. 2 Samuel 5, David reunited the kingdom under one throne. In 2 Samuel 6, David retrieved the ark and brought it back to Jerusalem. His next step was to solidify God's permanence in Israel. So he didn't want the ark to be able to just travel here and there and be stuck in a temporary structure that was the tabernacle they were still using from the time of Moses. In 2 Samuel 7, which is where we're going to pick up today, David decided he's going to build a temple. He had a plan. Why don't we pick up, hopefully you can see that. We're going to read 2 Samuel chapter 7, and we're going to go from 5 through 16. It starts out with, so initially, God shared this plan with the prophet Nathan. He said, I'm going to build a temple. And Nathan said, yeah, you know what? You're king. That's a good idea. You should go do that. Later that night, God spoke to Nathan in a dream, and he had to come back and tell David the following. Go and tell my servant David, this is what the Lord says. Are you the one to build me a house to dwell in? I have not dwelt in a house from the day I brought the Israelites up out of Egypt to this very day. I have been moving from place to place with a tent as my dwelling. Whenever I've moved with all the Israelites, did I ever say to any of the rulers who I commanded to shepherd my people, why have you not built me a house out of cedar? Now then, tell my servant David, this is what the Lord Almighty says. I took you from the pasture, from tending the flock, and appointed you ruler over my people Israel. I have been with you wherever you have gone, and I have cut off all your enemies from before you. Now I will make your name great, like the names of the greatest men on earth, and I will provide a place for my people Israel, and will plant them so that they can have a home of their own and no longer be disturbed. Wicked people will not oppress them anymore, as they did at the beginning, and have done so ever since the time I appointed leaders over my people. I will also give you rest from all of your enemies. The Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you. When your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up for you offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house in my name, and I will establish the throne in his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. When he does wrong, I will punish him with a rod wielded by men, as flogging inflicted by human hands. But my love will never be taken away from him, as I took it away from Saul, who I removed before you. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me, and your throne will be established forever. Like I said, David had a plan. Being a man after God's own heart, he wanted to see restoration in the kingdom, and he wanted to see unity. He was able to restore unity in the kingdom. He was able to return the ark to Jerusalem, and he sought to be at peace with his enemies. David wanted to build this permanent structure as a house, as a symbol that God would be with the people of Israel forever. He didn't want the Israelites to see this temporary structure as a threat that one day, if they continue to mess up again, that God would take this promised land back away from them. Or worse yet, they might have to go back out into the wilderness. Eventually they did, but that's a different sermon for a different time. What David did not realize was that God had a different plan. God's plan was for David to raise up the next generation and build the temple, to build the temple for him. God's covenant promise to David was that his family line would be blessed with a kingdom that would last forever. What this meant to David was that he had to change his mind about what his plans were. He would have to rethink what his legacy was as king. His plan to build a big fancy temple, the Temple of David, would have to wait for his son Solomon to take over as king and take on the project for himself. David had to trust that God would bless the next generation in the same way that he had been blessed. He would also have to be a patient teacher to his children. Having your plans change is not always easy. Understanding that you're not in control is extremely difficult, and that's something we've all had to face in the last 12 months. David, Abraham, Moses, and Noah all had plans. Nowhere in the Bible does it say that Noah planned to be a boat salesman. He was not in the Navy. He had no plans to be on board a ship, but it happened. Abraham was satisfied raising his family near Sodom. As we know, that probably would not be a good place to raise your family, as it turns out. Moses was content to be a shepherd. Once he left Egypt, he was content to just stay in the desert as a shepherd. It took some convincing for Moses to go back and encounter Pharaoh a second time later in his life and then lead the people. Each of these men was called to step out in faith and accept that God had a different plan in their life. They had to take action based on God's promises. Like I said in the beginning, Abraham, Moses, and now David did not see the full fulfillment of God's promise within their lifetime. And yet, they stayed faithful throughout. David believed in God's promise so much that the Bible tells us that whenever they captured soldiers in war, he took those people and he tasked them to be brickmakers. David spent the rest of his life, amongst other things, collecting building materials so that the temple could be built. That's an act of faith. God said, "Your son will build me a temple." David collected the materials. How likely are we to grab a hold of God's promise when you don't see the fruit right away? What if God told you he has a huge blessing in store, but you might not see it happen? But your job is to raise up the people who will see that happen. Something to think about. How about when the world around us, just like David, when the world around us is filled with turmoil and drama, people will let you down. Family can let us down. The government, not going there. We cannot let change and uncertainty be a distraction from God's goodness and faithfulness. God's plan should always rule over our agenda. I'll say that again. God's plan should always rule over our agenda. I have 3 key takeaways, 3 points from God's covenant promise to David. Number 1, there it is. God is faithful. We might feel sometimes like the world around us can be shifting sand. It feels like there's more in the world that we cannot trust than what we can. The news, the internet. It's really hard to determine sometimes what's actual truth and what's coming at us. It seems like every day situations are changing. David felt the same way. David knew this, and yet he understood for himself that he himself was part of the covenant promise that God made with the people before him. Just the fact that he was an Israelite is a reflection of God's promise to Abraham, that he would raise up for him a people. David was one of those people. God made a promise to Noah he would never again flood the earth as a result of sin. David lived in a sinful time, and yet he was still there. I assume there were still rainbows in David's time. And again with Moses, God had blessed David because he was faithful. That in itself is a reflection of Moses. So we can see, even in David's lifetime, the fulfillment of God's covenant promises. We can still see those things today. A lot of things might change, and there might be people or situations that we can't trust. But point number 1, God is faithful. Point number 2, God is faithful. Although the results might not be evident right away, God's promises never go away. Every time it rains and there's a rainbow in the sky, it's a reminder that God is faithful despite of our shortcomings. God's covenant promises sometimes can be conditional. In the Bible, there are times where there's a if-then, if my people who are called by my name, if we do the right thing, then God responds. There's other times in the Bible where there's unconditional covenants where God just tells you, I am going to bless you in this way. No matter what, whether it's conditional or unconditional, we need to understand, despite of our actions, God has never and will never walk away from what he promises. I'll read that again. God has never and will never walk away from what he promises. Lastly, third point, God is faithful. Last week, Phil pointed out that some translations in the Bible can be read that where God told Moses, I am that I am, it could also be taken as, I will be what I will be. Meaning, God is the same, yesterday, today, forever. The statement is not that God was faithful at one time. The statement is not that God might be faithful again. The statement is not even that God will be faithful in the future, but God is faithful today. Next week, we're going to look at the most impactful covenant promise that God made in the Bible. Jesus, who came from the line of David, comes down from heaven and establishes his kingdom by being a sacrifice for all of us on the cross. I want you to remember this week that while we might not always be in control of the outcome, we can always grab hold of the promises that God made, because God is faithful. Pray with me. Dear Lord, thank you for today. Lord, thank you for the sunshine after a rainy, snowy week. Lord, thank you for your covenant promises that you've made with your people, and thank you for being faithful to honor them. Lord, we look forward to the message next week where we see the new covenant. Lord, I just pray that you would continue to bless us. Lord, help us to remember that you are faithful. Despite our circumstances and what might go on in the world around us, Lord, help us to stay focused on you. Amen.